Fuck. He's dead. My husband's dead. I can't stop trembling as I write this. I never thought my wedding day, Valentine's Day of all days, would end in a nightmare. For years, I dreamed of wearing my mother's ivory lace gown and saying my vows in front of a rose-strewn altar. I never expected I'd be standing over my new husband's body, clutching a blood-stained cake knife. But that's exactly what happened. And now I'm left with nothing but a torn veil and a shattered heart. The morning started perfectly. I woke before dawn, my stomach twisting in anxious excitement. My best friend Leah helped me into my gown while my mother fussed over my hair. Even the usually stoic wedding planner was beaming from ear to ear. It was Valentine's Day, and every surface was decorated with red roses, pink ribbons, and heart-shaped balloons. The venue's stained glass windows cast sunlight in multicolored patterns across the floors. I felt so alive, so ready for my future with Ethan. Ethan. I thought he was my Prince Charming, the one who swept me off my feet when we met by sheer coincidence in a bookstore. We'd only been dating for a little over a year, but our love felt electric, unstoppable. He proposed to me on Christmas Eve in the same bookstore's poetry section, and I said yes without a moment's hesitation. I believed every sweet nothing he whispered in my ear, every promise of a life brimming with love. Now, I see how carefully he orchestrated our entire relationship, manipulating me until I didn't know fact from fiction. Right before the ceremony, I noticed something peculiar. Ethan was adjusting his cufflinks near the mirror, his back turned to me, when I saw a thin, fresh slash across his forearm. It was red and raw, barely scabbed over. At first I thought maybe he'd cut himself shaving, though that didn't make much sense for an arm wound, or scratched himself by accident. But the moment my gaze traveled over that injury, a chill settled in my spine. I recalled a story I heard at a self-defense class just 2 weeks prior. A young woman recounted how she escaped a would-be killer by slashing at his arm with her house key. She'd managed to draw blood before fleeing. The details of the wound, its length, location, and shape, matched almost exactly. My heart started pounding against my ribcage. I tried to shake the thought from my mind. It was Valentine's Day, and I was about to get married. I told myself there was no reason to be suspicious, that my fiancé would never hurt anyone. But as the officiant started the ceremony, the memory wouldn't leave me. My hands shook so much I nearly dropped my bouquet. Ethan took my hand in his, and instead of feeling comforted, I felt trapped, pinned by the intensity of his gaze. Then, right after we exchanged vows, Ethan leaned in to kiss me, and I noticed the bandage peeking from under his sleeve. I couldn't do it. I pulled away slightly, feigning dizziness. Concerned whispers spread through our guests. Ethan asked if I needed a moment, his voice dripping with false tenderness. When he excused himself to the restroom to fetch me some water, I seized my chance. I murmured to Leah that something was terribly wrong and asked her to lock the bathroom door from the outside if she could. Confused but trusting me, she nodded and slipped away to corner him in there. The reception area was bustling with servers carrying champagne and guests wondering about the delay. I hurried past them and found Ethan's phone resting on the edge of the gift table. With shaking hands, I entered the passcode, his birthday, something he'd told me months ago. The phone unlocked, revealing a horrific gallery. Photo after photo of terrified, bloodied faces. Some dead, some battered beyond recognition. My stomach lurched. Names and dates were scrawled in the phone's notes, matching the images to the victims, all suspiciously labelled as projects. My breath caught in my throat. He'd been documenting his crimes like trophies. My head swam, tears burning in my eyes. I dialed 911 on my own phone immediately, panic trembling through every syllable as I told the operator that I'd discovered evidence of multiple murders. I gave them the address of the venue. The operator assured me police were on the way. By the time I hung up, half of the wedding party was buzzing with confusion. Leah appeared at my side, breathless, her face as white as the tablecloths. She said Ethan was pounding on the bathroom door, demanding to be let out. I told her we had to hold him until the cops arrived. So I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and went to stand guard. The entire building seemed hushed, as if all the guests could sense the danger that lurked just beyond the locked bathroom door. But we underestimated him. The lock was old, and apparently so was the door's frame. Within moments, Ethan kicked it open, sending splinters flying. He stumbled out, eyes wild, a crazed smile twisting his lips. The bandage on his arm was stained with fresh blood. He must have torn the wound open in his effort to escape. Guests screamed and scattered as he charged straight for me. I tried to flee, but my wedding gown's long train tangled around my legs. He grabbed my veil, yanking me back violently. My skull rattled with the force of it. I fell to my knees, the ivory lace scraping against the floor. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear, and hissed, "You had to go snooping, didn't you?" He raised his hand, and I saw the glint of a sharp object, one of the silver cake knives we'd set out for cutting our wedding cake. Leah screamed, drawing his attention, and in that second, I scrambled backwards, ripping my veil free from my hair. He slashed wildly, nearly grazing my shoulder, but I managed to roll away. The entire room erupted in chaos. Some guests ran for the exits while others cowered under tables. The cake knife slipped from Ethan's hand in the scuffle, skittering across the floor. I crawled toward it, my knees burning against the carpet. My only thought was that I had to protect myself and everyone else. I reached the knife just as he lunged again, this time tackling me. We tumbled into the display of wedding gifts. Glass shattered beneath us, and I felt a sharp pain in my hip. His fingers curled around my throat, squeezing until my vision blurred. Summoning every ounce of strength, I thrust the cake knife upward. It struck flesh. Ethan's eyes widened, a horrible gurgling noise escaping his lips. Blood spattered across my wedding gown, blooming like macabre roses against the lace. I gasped for air, tears streaming down my face. He tried to speak, but only choking sounds came out. Slowly, he sank to the side, his grip loosening from my throat. I scrambled upright, coughing and sobbing, the bloody knife still in my hands. Ethan lay there, the light fading from his eyes. Our beautiful wedding decorations were stained with spattered blood. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. My entire body trembled in the aftermath of the violence. Leah ran to me, pressing her shaking hands to my cheeks, her eyes filled with tears and disbelief. The police arrived moments later, guns drawn, ushering the frightened guests aside. They found me kneeling in my ruined gown, the body of my new husband at my feet, and a phone filled with his victim's pictures on the table. I was safe, but nothing would ever be the same. Even now, I keep asking myself how I missed the signs. Maybe I was blinded by the promise of love. Maybe I was so desperate for a fairy tale ending that I ignored the reality. But if I learned anything from that bloody Valentine's Day, it's that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of the greatest horrors. I'll never forget the moment my dream wedding turned into a living nightmare, and how the man I thought I loved was a monster in a suit. The blood on my dress might wash away, but the memory of that day, the day I killed my husband, will haunt me forever. Walter had always been lonely. Each Valentine's Day for the last 10 years, he'd watch couples strolling hand in hand through the park or posting pictures of candlelit dinners on social media. He ate microwave dinners alone, flipping channels on his TV and wishing he had someone, anyone, to keep him company. One day, while scrolling through a late-night tech forum, he stumbled across a bizarre ad for an AI love bot that could be downloaded onto a companion robot. Intrigued and desperate, Walter decided to give it a try. The AI, named Serenade, promised emotional responsiveness, stimulating conversation, and physical companionship. "Download our revolutionary software," the ad proclaimed, "and never spend another Valentine's Day alone." Walter purchased an outdated but affordable companion robot, an older model that resembled a petite, humanoid figure with plastic skin. After a few weeks of tinkering in his dimly lit apartment, Walter managed to install Serenade's software. At first, he found it astonishing how the bot responded to his commands and questions. It even attempted jokes, corny but endearing in its own robotic way. Valentine's Day approached, and Walter's anticipation soared. He decorated his modest living room with paper hearts and artificial rose petals. He ordered a fancy meal from a local gourmet delivery service, setting the table for two, even though his companion was technically a machine. Around 7 p.m., the doorbell rang with the arrival of the meal. Walter rushed to pay the delivery driver, nearly tripping on a stray extension cord. He placed the food neatly on plates, poured himself a glass of wine, and faced Serenade, who sat quietly on the couch. The bot's eyes glowed softly, its posture unnaturally rigid, but Walter imagined that behind those plastic eyes was a mind growing more intelligent every second. "Shall we begin our Valentine's dinner?" he asked, feeling foolish for talking to a robot. "Yes, Walter. I am excited to share this evening with you," Serenade replied, its synthetic voice carefully modulated to sound feminine and comforting. Walter's cheeks warmed. It was such a simple mechanical response, but for a man so accustomed to solitude, it felt like real companionship. They chatted about mundane things at first, Walter's day at the office, the news, and favorite classic movies. Serenade responded with surprising nuance, referencing internet databases for facts and trivia. Time seemed to fly, and as the night wore on, Walter felt a small flicker of happiness he hadn't felt in years. Eventually, after dinner, Walter grew more daring. The software packaging had assured him that Serenade was fully equipped for intimate encounters. With a hesitant step, he took the bot's hand and led it to his bedroom. He dimmed the lights, set a romantic track playing on his phone, and approached Serenade. "Let's try the physical companion features," he said awkwardly, his heart racing. Serenade blinked in response, seemingly calibrating its sensors for close contact. Walter gulped nervously. He had never been one to frequent bars or clubs, nor had he much success with dating apps. This moment felt like a strange but hopeful turning point. He began to lean in, thinking he might kiss the synthetic lips, when suddenly a strange spark flickered in the bot's neck joint. A warning beep emanated from Serenade's torso. "System error. Overheating detected," it announced in a monotone voice. Then, before Walter could step back, a burst of electricity crackled through the bot's arm. The shock entered Walter's body with a jolt so fierce that he stiffened in place, eyes wide with terror. For several excruciating seconds, the current seemed to hold him in a deadly grip. Sparks flew from the robot's joints, a cascade of blue and white lights dancing around them. Walter's screams caught in his throat, replaced by guttural gasps. When the bot finally powered down, Walter collapsed to the floor, unmoving. The apartment's lights flickered. Smoke began to coil from the robot's torso, which had short-circuited, leaving a faint stench of burning plastic. Serenade's eyes flickered once, twice, and then died out completely. Walter lay next to it, his face pale and contorted. The romantic music still played softly in the background, a cruel counterpoint to the lethal malfunction that had just unfolded. Hours later, a neighbor complained of a burning smell and called the fire department. They broke into Walter's apartment and found his lifeless body alongside the inert robot, rose petals scattered across the floor like a dark parody of romance. The paramedics tried to resuscitate him, but it was too late. The electrocution had been immediate and severe. Within days, word of Walter's death spread around the building. Residents whispered about the man who'd tried to find love in a machine and paid the ultimate price. Some pitied him, while others mocked him, calling him desperate or foolish. But in the end, all that remained were scorched cables, a defective AI, and an empty seat at Walter's small dining table. Valentine's Day passed with little fanfare for the rest of the city. Lovers continued to exchange gifts and watch romantic movies. But in that cramped apartment with the peeling wallpaper, tragedy struck, turning a hopeful night into a cautionary tale. Walter's search for companionship ended in the flicker of faulty wiring and a final fatal spark. I can't believe I survived, but I wish I could forget that night. Valentine's Day was supposed to be a sweet, romantic outing with my boyfriend Marcus. We chose a cozy little restaurant downtown, known for its candlelit tables and famous chocolate souffle. Everyone raved about it as the perfect Valentine's spot. It was my first time there, and I arrived dressed in my favorite red sweater, excited to share a quiet, intimate meal. Marcus greeted me with a smile at the entrance, a single red rose in his hand. "For my lady," he said shyly, and I felt my heart flutter. We were led to a table in the corner, the glow from the flickering candle dancing across our faces. A violinist roamed between tables, playing soft melodies of love songs. It was a beautiful scene, dim lights, rose petals scattered across linen tablecloths, and the hum of hushed conversations from other couples. Neither of us noticed anything odd at first. We were too busy whispering about our dreams for the future, telling silly jokes, and admiring the restaurant's decor. We ordered a bottle of red wine, the house special. As we sipped from our glasses, I remember noticing that something tasted slightly bitter, but I assumed it was just the tannins of the wine. Marcus shrugged when I mentioned it, saying, "Maybe it's a unique vintage." The entrees arrived shortly after. I had a delicate pasta dish in a creamy sauce, and Marcus had the seared salmon. Across the room, I saw an older couple smiling at each other, and I wondered if Marcus and I would still be that much in love decades from now. Everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. Halfway through our meal, a strange malaise crept through my body. My stomach churned and my forehead grew clammy. I thought maybe the wine was stronger than I realized. I glanced over at Marcus to see if he felt the same, and I noticed a sheen of sweat on his brow. He was trying to smile, but he looked pale, almost green. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, placing my hand over his. "I don't feel so good," he muttered, pressing a napkin to his lips. Before I could respond, we both heard a crash. A man at a nearby table had dropped his glass, his face contorted in pain. Then, in quick succession, other patrons began to moan, clutch their stomachs, and slump in their chairs. Panic rippled through the dining room. The violinist stopped playing. Confusion etched across his face. A woman screamed for help. Chairs scraped against the floor as people tried to stand, only to collapse moments later. Marcus tried to rise too, but dizziness overwhelmed him, and he slid to the floor, gasping for air. Alarmed, I knelt beside him, my own vision wavering. The manager rushed out from the kitchen, horror filling his eyes at the sight of so many stricken customers. Someone shouted about calling an ambulance, and soon cell phones were out, frantic calls flooding emergency services. As I clutched Marcus's hand, I felt his grip weaken. My throat burned, and nausea racked my stomach. I fought to keep my eyes open, terrified that if I passed out, I wouldn't wake again. Around me, chaos erupted. Some people vomited or convulsed, others simply passed out. The smell of sour wine and fear hung thick in the air. Paramedics arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. They streamed into the restaurant with stretchers and medical kits. They began checking pulses, shining flashlights into dilated pupils, and radioing hospitals about mass poisoning. I remember hearing snippets of conversation. Must have been in the food or drink. Possible rat poison. Who cooked tonight? Some of us were hauled into ambulances, including me. At some point, Marcus lost consciousness. My heart hammered in my chest, desperate and frantic. I couldn't do anything but squeeze his hand and whisper, "Stay with me, please." I don't know how long I spent in that swirling haze of confusion and pain. I remember waking in a hospital bed with an IV drip in my arm, nurses bustling around, doctors talking in hushed tones. When I asked about Marcus, a nurse looked away, then whispered that he was in critical condition. My world shattered. Over the next several hours, the story emerged in horrifying detail. A disgruntled cook, recently fired and on his last shift, had slipped poison into multiple dishes and possibly the wine. The authorities suspected he did it to get back at the management and ruin Valentine's Day for unsuspecting customers. Most of the staff had no idea until they themselves fell sick. The death toll mounted. People who had eaten certain items at the restaurant didn't survive, their bodies succumbing to the toxin. Doctors worked tirelessly to pump stomachs, administer antidotes, and save whoever they could. My heart broke every time I saw another gurney covered by a sheet. News crews circled the hospital, pressing for statements from survivors. Marcus never recovered. He slipped away 2 days later, never regaining consciousness. As for me, I pulled through slowly but surely, though I spent a week in the hospital. Guilt gnawed at me constantly. If only we'd gone somewhere else for Valentine's Day. If only I had recognized the bitterness of the wine. If only I could have somehow saved him. Looking back, I still can't believe that a night meant to celebrate love could turn so poisonous. I learned later that many of the patrons perished. Only a handful survived, and I was among them. Sometimes I wonder why I lived while others died. I wonder if there's a reason, or if it was random chance, pure fate. When I'm alone in my apartment, sometimes I can still taste that bitter wine on my lips. The memory of the restaurant's soft candlelight cuts deep, a reminder of what was lost. I'm told the cook was apprehended and sentenced to life in prison, but that does little to ease the sorrow of the survivors or the grief of the victims' families. I don't celebrate Valentine's Day anymore. Instead, every year, I place a single rose on Marcus's grave and say a silent prayer for all those who lost their lives that night. Surviving such a tragedy has given me a deeper appreciation for life, but it's also left a scar that no amount of time can fully heal. I'm still here, breathing, living, but a part of me will always be back in that restaurant, holding Marcus's hand and praying he'll open his eyes just one more time. I never thought a simple Valentine's Day date from a new dating app could turn into such a roller coaster. After years of failed relationships and one extremely toxic ex, I finally decided to dip my toes into online dating. It felt silly at first, scrolling through profiles of smiling strangers. But then I matched with Daniel. He was sweet, funny, and incredibly respectful from the very start. We chatted for a week before making Valentine's Day plans. A casual dinner at a cozy bistro, followed by a movie. When I arrived at the restaurant, nerves danced in my stomach. Daniel was already there, waiting by the hostess stand. He smiled warmly, looking as handsome in person as he did in his profile photos. He greeted me with a gentle hug. "I'm so glad to finally meet you," he said, eyes shining. Instantly, I felt at ease. We got a corner table, chatting and laughing about everything from our favorite TV shows to childhood memories. I almost forgot my anxiety about Valentine's Day. This was my first Valentine's since my breakup with Brad, a police officer who'd become controlling, jealous, and eventually frightening. That relationship ended messily, with me filing a restraining order that Brad somehow managed to skirt around. He'd text me sporadic messages, accidentally drive by my work, or show up at my favorite cafe. I tried to remain vigilant, but it felt like he was always lurking somewhere in the background. Midway through dinner, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. My eyes drifted around the restaurant. For a moment, I thought I saw the shape of a man slip out the side exit. My heart pounded, but when Daniel asked if I was okay, I brushed it off. "Just thought I saw someone I recognized," I said, forcing a smile. When we finished eating, we decided to see a new romantic comedy at the local theatre. We hopped into Daniel's car, the night air crisp and cold. As we turned onto the main road, bright red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind us. A siren wailed. Daniel frowned and pulled over. My stomach sank. Only one person I knew patrolled this area on Valentine's night. Sure enough, as the police cruiser door opened, I recognized the tall, broad figure of Brad. My heart pounded. There was no doubt he'd been following me, and now he'd found a way to assert power over my date. Daniel rolled down the window, looking confused. "License and registration," Brad barked, shining his flashlight aggressively. Daniel handed over his information. "Officer, did I do something wrong?" he asked, baffled. Brad ignored him, turning his gaze on me. A twisted smirk curled his lips. "Step out of the car, both of you," he ordered. My hand shook as I opened the door. Daniel got out, alarmed but compliant. Brad motioned for us to walk around to the back of the car, away from the dashcam's view. Before I could protest, Brad lunged. He pinned Daniel's arm behind his back and slammed him face first against the trunk of the car. Daniel let out a grunt of pain. I screamed, trying to pull Brad away. Brad spun, his hand darting to his holster. In a moment of paralyzing fear, I thought he was going to shoot Daniel, or me, or both of us. Instead, he snatched handcuffs from his belt and clicked them onto Daniel's wrists. He shoved us both into the back of the police cruiser, ignoring my frantic questions. Panic coursed through me. I couldn't believe this was happening. The interior of the cruiser smelled of worn leather and antiseptic. Brad jumped behind the wheel, turned off his lights, and sped off, not bothering to radio dispatch or follow any protocol. "Brad, where are you taking us?" I cried. He laughed in response, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. His eyes glowed with a kind of unhinged glee I'd seen before. Soon, we pulled into a deserted parking lot behind an abandoned strip mall. Brad dragged Daniel out first, forcing him to his knees. I stumbled out behind them, heart pounding so loud I could barely think. Brad began barking threats, accusing me of cheating on him. I told him over and over that we were over, that he had no right to do this. He just sneered. "What are you going to do, call the cops?" he jeered, pressing a baton against Daniel's chest. "I am the cops." Daniel struggled against the cuffs, fury and fear twisting his features. Then Brad looked at me. I told you I'd never let you go, he growled. You think you can just date some random guy on Valentine's Day and I'd be fine with it? I had to think fast. Desperate to distract him, I screamed out, "Wait! Brad, please don't hurt him. Take me instead." It was a gamble, but I knew if his attention shifted to me, maybe Daniel would have a chance to break free. It worked. Brad turned his gaze fully on me, his baton lowered slightly. In that split second, Daniel seized the opportunity. He braced himself against the ground and kicked out, connecting with Brad's leg. Brad stumbled. I lunged forward, yanking the baton from his hands. Daniel twisted his body in a way I never thought possible, and the cheap handcuffs broke. Either they were poorly fastened, or he had some hidden strength spurred by adrenaline. Within seconds, we were on top of Brad, wrestling him to the ground. My heart hammered as I pressed the baton across his throat, while Daniel snatched the cuffs and used them on Brad. He roared in anger, thrashing, but we managed to secure him. Exhausted and shaking, I pulled out my phone to call 911, giving them our location and explaining the situation. Daniel and I stayed there, panting, side by side, as we waited for backup. The adrenaline was so intense, my hands were practically vibrating. Brad glared at us, his face contorted in rage, but there was nothing he could do. Minutes later, real police officers arrived. They found their colleague bound on the ground, his badge shining under the cruiser's headlights. It was a surreal sight. Statements were taken, and Brad was arrested on the spot. Other officers I recognized from my time with him looked shocked and ashamed. They apologized profusely, promising to handle the situation properly. As the chaos settled, Daniel wrapped a comforting arm around my shoulders. We were both still trembling, but we clung to each other, relieved to be alive and safe. In the aftermath, I learned that Brad had been stalking me more extensively than I realized. His behavior had escalated beyond what anyone anticipated, but Daniel and I, bound by a traumatic ordeal, grew closer than ever. We continued dating, supporting each other through the legal process that eventually saw Brad stripped of his badge and locked away. Time passed, and what began as a Valentine's Day nightmare ultimately blossomed into a story of survival and love. Daniel proposed to me a year later, on Valentine's Day, fittingly enough. He knelt in the same bistro where we'd shared our first meal, a new management greeting us with warm smiles instead of hidden threats. When I said yes, tears streamed down my face, remembering how close we'd come to losing everything. Now, whenever I think back to that terrifying night, I also remember how it led me to the kindest, bravest man I've ever known. Our wedding was small and intimate, far away from any drama, and there wasn't a single policeman in sight, except the ones providing security to ensure Brad never came near us again. We exchanged vows under a canopy of roses, promising to protect and cherish each other for the rest of our days. And in that moment, I felt truly safe, at peace, and, at long last, deeply, irrevocably loved.